Hello everyone, welcome to our seventh proper lecture. This is the topic of why the world is divided territorially. And here really we're trying to get our heads around the concept of the emergence of the modern state. It didn't always exist, it came from somewhere, so we have to try to understand why that's so. And we also have to try to understand the stakes in that move towards the territorial state, right? Because it comes with benefits and costs, right? There are certain things that are lost once you have the territorial state for global politics, and we want to sort of try to track some of those issues. Now, a lot of the people we think about in terms of trying to assess this are geographers. Those are people who specialize in territorial studies and human geography. And we'll be taking some time today to think about some of the things that geographers are talking to us about. And then the author of our chapter this week, in fact, is what you will, maybe like a political geographer, I suppose would be the term for that. And so in the opening slide here, we have an image which is a representation of the Treaty of Westphalia. And in this class, there aren't really any dates that I ask you guys to remember, except this one, right? 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia is signed, and it is a game changer insofar as we're concerned, because while a lot of the developments that led up to it were boiling away in the years beforehand, really I think most people take 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia, as depicted here, as a kind of a conventional date for thinking about the birth of what we call modernity. We can say modern international relations theory if you want. But it's important to think about what was going on at the time of the Treaty of Westphalia. It was a time in the aftermath of 100 years of war, the so-called 100 Years' War. And I guess that's a complex historical thing, the 100 Years' War, to get your heads around, but for our purposes, what we generally try to think about in terms of the importance of the 100 Years of War is that it's a conflict that emerged in tandem with the emergence of Protestantism, and this led to tremendous confusion in the European regime, which was previously articulated around the religious influence and power of the Vatican. If you will, the laws and norms of the Vatican gave it a power above and beyond the normal nation states of Europe. The Vatican had a kind of a moral suasion that other nation states did not have. The Vatican could order nation states, for example, to engage in a crusade, and that's not to say nation states didn't go to war with each other, but when they did, they generally had to justify to the Vatican, and they had to use the Vatican's language. And so it gave the Vatican a sort of a power, a vertical power over the other nation states. We've used the metaphor of billiard balls before. Well, this is kind of a situation where you had one billiard ball floating vertically over the other billiard balls. And that's interesting for us historically, because it's sort of, as the metaphor I've been using clearly breaks down, once you start to think about floating billiard balls, it obviously reveals a problem with the way we think about international relations. If we are of a mind that international relations is always and everywhere a billiard ball model, then how the hell can a billiard ball float above the others? So it is bringing in the question of history here. It is bringing in the question of whether the nation states of the world have always existed as they have. When does this horizontal model of international relations emerge, and why? Well, Westphalia 1648 is generally the date that that's considered to be, where that's considered to have taken place, because it's here that because of the emergence of Protestantism and the emergence of religious disputes over which country should be which religion, the warring parties came together to negotiate a treaty wherein they agreed to respect each other's territorial boundaries and not care what's going on within them. So If you're the king of one country, whatever you do inside those borders is up to you. And if you're a Protestant and the population is Catholic, then if you want to push the people around to make them Protestant, that's fine. And conversely, for Catholics, so or for a Catholic king. So it is this principle of non-intervention, or what we call the norm of non-intervention, then that emerges. I'm going to let you do your thing in your place, and you're going to let me do my thing in mine. And from 1648, it said that this model basically survives all the way through until, well, maybe today, but some people say that it ended in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, because that is the last time we had a sort of a division, a serious division between two nation states. Today we have globalization, and globalization doesn't really work the same way as the billiard ball model, because we are all interdependent and we are existing in networks of flows. It's not to say there's no military threats, but those military threats are embedded in the networks. They don't really have a flag per se. You know, what's the country today that's the enemy? It's not clear. We have networks, we have movements, we have terrorists, things like that. So perhaps we've seen the end of the territorial division of the world in some instances. Obviously that's a complex point, but anyway. So first of all, we want to talk about what's at stake in the emergence and the birth of this thing called a modern nation state. And one of the examples I like to offer to think about the stakes of the birth of the nation state is that of the nomadic people who inhabit still certain parts of the world, for example in Botswana. So if the world is divided into units called nation states, that does reflect a certain attitude and a certain understanding of the relationship of human politics to territory. And it's not the case that it's always been arranged this way. And we can see that very clearly if we look at the relationship that nomadic peoples have with the current configuration of the nation state. The people, for example, the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert in Botswana, they had to be sort of put in their place once the modern state of Botswana came along. Previously, as nomadic peoples, they would not have necessarily respected things like borders because, well, there were no borders, first of all, but they didn't carry passports either, and they didn't consider themselves people from Botswana. They considered themselves, well, Kalahari nomads, I suppose. What does it mean then for people who don't understand the nation state, who don't feel they belong to the nation state, to suddenly find themselves living in this thing called the nation state? I think it means that they are going to have to make some accommodations. And indeed, they had to be accommodated, the Kalahari Bushmen. They were accommodated, first of all, as the British took power in 1961. They were found themselves living in this game preserve that the British had set up. Then, of course, Botswanan independence happened in 1966, and the state obviously had different intentions about what to do with the nomads than the British system. So in 1966, the government started to relocate them to give them better facilities, you know, to give them a better life in their view. But of course, in doing so, they were also attempting to settle them, which was taking their form of life away from them. And of course, the big problem happens in the 1980s, where diamonds are discovered in the territory. And in 2002, the government used violence to try to suppress the Bushmen. Before, in 2006, a court decision gave them the right to return to their tribal lands. So that's an example of how the very idea of a nation state, not any particular nation state, but the very idea of a nation state in its most general form, clashes with the most general form of nomadic existence And of course, that could be said to have happened anywhere. I mean, it happened in the United States, happened in Australia, it's happening today in the Amazon rainforest. There's lots of places around the world where you see nomadic people still trying to live their traditional lifestyle, and we see quite clearly how incompatible it is with the developmental goals of the nation state. So now that we have the nation state, it behooves us, I think, to think about some of the problems that attend this phenomena. The difficulty of achieving cooperation between nation states, for example. We don't have a government over the nation states, so how do those nation states relate to each other? Oftentimes it's with great difficulty. We've talked before in this class about the prisoner's dilemma, and I think there is a certain truth to the prisoner's dilemma, of course. Especially when you think about common problems that states experience, like global warming. And it's not clear as well how nation states sort of pick and choose who they're going to open their borders to. Either consider, for example, the border between Palestinian people and Israel versus the borders in the European Union. So we have this kind of strange selectivity which attests to the fact that not all nation states are able to engage in cooperation. But I think also the idea of the nation state comes with a problem as well, insofar as it locks us into thinking about only certain types of problems as being sort of international problems, right? And other types of problems we consider to be merely domestic or local. That's perhaps a false impression that we get because we're so used to thinking about global politics or international politics as being to do with nation states. I think, if anything, what we're seeing here is that the state itself is a phenomena of global politics, and as such, even sometimes its domestic affairs, such as the plight of the Kalahari Bushmen, even its domestic affairs can be considered to be global political affairs, global phenomena, insofar as they represent case studies of what the nation state has cost people in terms of its existence. So let's talk a little bit more then about what it is, this thing that we have, the nation state. We recall Max Weber's definition. We've talked about this before, that a state is that human community which successfully lays claim to the monopoly of a legitimate physical violence within a certain territory. We talked about that before in class. There's a lot of different elements there. We have community, we have legitimacy, we have violence, and we have territory. Those things are worth breaking down for a moment. We've talked about the fact that the nation state is merely just a grouping of human beings, right? But it's different as a grouping of human beings to, say, a troop of Boy Scouts or a religion or a corporation, because it has something that those groups don't have, and that is the ability to take up an army, a legitimate army, right? To give the power of violence to a sanctioned group of individuals who can then use that force within a certain territory. That is, of course, a fairly thin definition in some respects. If you think about the American Civil War, for example, you know that that legitimacy that we're talking about there can be challenged. And it's hard to know where that legitimacy really is challenged. At the end of the day, really, I suppose it depends on whether there's a revolution or not. If you see a revolution, then you know de facto that the legitimacy has been challenged, or a revolt or a civil war. Those things indicate that the legitimacy has been challenged. The legitimacy of the army, the legitimacy of the way the nation state is being governed. But I think a lot of people can be very frustrated with a state, even though they're not in a state of revolt or civil war. So you may not like the nation state, and in that sense it may be illegitimate in your eyes. But if there's no war, effectively the legitimacy has not been challenged. So it's not like this is a legitimacy that's defined negatively, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not defined by us voting for it. Nobody votes for the nation state, you know. That's not something that ever happened historically. Um, but we do sort of vote by not objecting, if you know what I mean. So I think that's a very important part of Max Weber's definition. So what does it mean then to say we live in nation states? If we have communities that express their legitimacy by not objecting to the presence of a legitimate army within their territory that is sort of there to protect and serve the interests of the government. And that's what we all live in. We may, of course, vote for the government of that phenomena, but we don't vote for the phenomena itself, right? So in that sense, we have to contend with the fact that nation states are those phenomena that govern us in the final instance. They govern us in the sense of our territory, right? And so it leads to the question of territory, or simply land or earth, as we're saying here. Generally today, we use the word territory to mean an area around a place. But of course, in this sense, in the sense we're using it here, it is the territory of the nation state. It is the bounded space claimed by some authority or other. Max Giddens suggests the state should be referred to as a bordered power container. That means that the border is sort of holding in the state. And that, of course, is an interesting point, especially in relation to some of the conversation we've had earlier this semester. For example, if you recall the debate between Michael Walzer and Charles Beitz, where they talked about whether or not the state could be challenged and what conditions would have to be in place such that the state would be challenged. So the reality is that this bordered power container, this territory, is not a given. It's an unstable territory, and its administration is contested and challenged sometimes, even though it can be stable for long periods of time. So we're focusing in our lecture, of course, on the idea of the European territorial state. We want to ask, why do we organize our political space as territories? Why do we live in this thing called a nation state? Among the earliest examples we have of bounded territories, or power container territories, as to use our previous language, are the Greek city-states. And they looked a little bit like the states that we have today, because they too featured centralized rule from, say, like a capital city over surrounding land or territory. But in distinction to the types of territory that we have today, the Greek city-states, the further you got from them, the more fuzzy the border became. These city-states had an inability to project their power very widely. And so at the furthest point from the city, there was no border with a passport control point as we sort of recognize today as being important, or sort of the way things are done. Back then, you would find overlapping claims to territory, and oftentimes those overlapping claims would be just fine by the people in those nation states. For example, as the book argues, nation states were happy to share even religious sites of religious significance. They would be common to both countries. So in that sense, you would have something like a kind of a shared governance, or a shared claim, which was seemingly fine by the people involved. Actually, oddly, today we're kind of turning back to that in some respects because of the emergence of things like the European Union, which have put resources like coal and steel under common jurisdiction of all the nation states of Europe. So that is kind of an interesting fact, that we lost some of this fuzziness during the modern period. But today, in what some people call the postmodern period, we are returning to a certain fuzziness. So how does this form, this idea of a nation state with centralized rule over surrounding land, how does that travel from the ancient Greek city-states to the rest of the world, which is what eventually happened? Although, of course, it's not the case that there were no civilizations elsewhere that did not have state-like phenomena. But the truth of the matter is that it was the Europeans largely who did sort of export the form of the modern state, because they were the ones that imperialized most of the world. If we think about Rome for a minute, we get some sense of some of the drama that is entailed in this spreading of the European model. The first thing we do, the first port of call, if you will, is to think about the Roman Empire and how it contrasted with Greece. Now Rome was a different sort of arrangement of power than the Greek arrangement of power. Instead of having a multitude of city-states with their own capital cities, Rome just assumed that the whole world was its dominion. It didn't really see other nation-states. It just didn't see them. And it assumed that the whole world was its realm, and every man in it would be its subject. Now, of course, that's not to say that the Romans didn't know that there were parts of the world that they didn't administer in a de facto sense, but they considered that just no man's land. They didn't respect that there might be other states or communities there. They just called it terra nullius, and I presume would have sort of looked at it as land that they had yet to get around to conquering. So the Romans had borders, but they were not borders in the sense of like citizenship checkpoints. No one was asking for a passport again, just like with the Greeks. These borders were more like defensive positions and holding points within the empire. In this picture here, we see a depiction here of a famous event, which is the founding of the Roman Empire, the founding of the Roman Republic, rather, in which an Etruscan king had raped Lucretia, the daughter of a leading Roman family. And that led to the principle central to Rome that no man should be a dictator, no man should be outside the law. This form of government lasted, of course, until the time of the Roman Empire, when there did now emerge sort of more dictator-type positions and regimes within the Roman Empire. But of course, eventually it fell apart in the 5th century. Charlemagne tried to reboot it in 800, and that lasted for a few hundred years. But the Roman Empire today, of course, some people say it never really ceased to exist. It ebbed and flowed, but that the European civilization still sort of harkens back to those days, and that the European Union today looks something like a Roman Empire for our own times. There's a famous joke by Voltaire, by the way, where he says the Roman civilization was neither particularly Roman nor particularly civilized. The idea there being, of course, that Rome had a lot of blood on its hands, on the one hand, but more than that, that the fact that it encompassed such a wide expanse of what was to them the known world, that it just seemed like it was a behemoth. The Roman Empire in 395 AD here, just to give you a sense of the geographic expanse that it encompassed. Now, we said earlier on the Treaties of Westphalia were important, and I've already said a lot about Treaties of Westphalia in the introduction. But just to sort of drill down a little bit, the so-called era of Christendom, we talked about the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire. That lasted through until the 16th century. And then in 1648, after 100 years of war due to the emergence of Protestantism, which broke down the Holy Roman Empire, significantly anyway, we have the emergence of a new type of way of organizing international politics. And we've said earlier on in the introduction that there was the principle of non-intervention. The technical term for that, of course, is chaos regio, ius religio. And that is another way of saying or referring to the principle of non-intervention. What it really means is, to whom has the crown, so goes the religion. It basically means that you can do whatever you want within your own domain as the king. And that, you may say, sounds very dictatorial, but to the people involved in the Treaty of Westphalia, it sounded like the best possible solution, because, in fact, there had been a whole lot of bloodshed for the previous 100 years, and they needed a way to agree to disagree, and the only way to achieve that was to instantiate this principle. But for many people, this is the first sort of explicit expression of the fact that European states could come together and agree on how to live together. So people say that this is maybe the first time we've seen an actual society of states, because previously to then, of course, with the Roman Empire and with then subsequently the Holy Roman Empire, and I've just realized I've murdered the Voltaire quote earlier on, wasn't it? My apologies. If you want to come back with me in just a second here, that Voltaire quote that I was talking about earlier on was referring to the Holy Roman Empire, and it was the idea that the Holy Roman Empire was neither Roman nor particularly holy. My apologies. Anyway, back to this point. The idea of a European society of states, of course, could hardly exist under something hierarchical like the Vatican, because that's more like a hegemony, and the verticality of power there denies the possibility of a society. A society is something more horizontal, right? So here we have the transition from an era that was articulated around the principle of Republicana Christiana, which is the medieval period, and we move from that period into a society of modern secular states. And not to say that that was a good thing necessarily either, right? Because, of course, this is where you start to get the principle of realism and what some people say or regard as a very cynical attitude towards state power, which is that, you know, the nation state's foreign policy should be based on a calculation of self-interests and not, say, religious values. Now, of course, the religious values had caused enough bloodshed, but some people would say that articulating the state's foreign policy exclusively around the principle of self-interests, which is what started to happen after Westphalia, and that's what they agreed, you know, would create a kind of a callous and uncaring world whereby nobody would be able to do anything about the problems of the world, say the suffering of people in other parts of the world from your own. So it's strange. You're going from one sort of area where religious commitments and values are creating all kinds of conflict, and obviously that's not an appropriate way to live. But then you move to the era of realism, the era of the modern nation state under the Treaty of Westphalia, and there perhaps you have a different problem, which is that nobody cares about anything at all, except their own self-interests. And that can also lead to conflict too, of course. We have to talk about imperialism. We have to talk about the emergence of empire. After Westphalia, technologically speaking, the Europeans also started to develop what were called intensive and extensive powers. And I think the idea of intensive powers are very interesting First of all, intensive powers are the ability to engage in with your population and develop your population. You think about, for example, Chancellor Bismarck in Germany in the 19th century, who would have modeled some of these intensive powers for us, right? He believed that the best Germany would be the Germany with a highly educated population, such that it could be ready for war and ready for military conquer and glory. A lot of people would call that socialism today, but for him it just made military sense. The fact is, Prussia, Bismarck's Germany, became a very powerful state through these kinds of intensive technologies. And then we also have extensive technologies. Extensive technologies make empire at a distance possible, right? So if you have the telegraph and you have faster communications and you have shipping and transportation means for your soldiers, then you can project power at great distance. So hence the European imperial states were able to drive what we sometimes call today the first wave of globalization. That is to say, globalization that while it may not have been properly global in the sense of everyone trading and networking with everyone, within the dominion, of the European empires, there was a lot of traffic, there was a lot of circulation. So what did the Europeans do once they conquered territories? Consider, for example, places like India. Well, they would often engage in mapping. They would set up administrations and bureaucracies that looked much like the bureaucracies they'd had at home. And so as a result of this, you end up with a European model of nation-state almost everywhere around the world. And this is how, of course, European international law becomes normalized, European standards and practices of diplomacy, and of course the idea, as we've mentioned before, of the Westphalian balance of power, or the Westphalian realpolitik. All of these things start to be applied around the world. But then, of course, the European empires start to fall apart around about the time of World War I. The empires break up, and the question is, how are the nation states, which didn't exist before the Europeans came along, now going to survive? They've been fighting, a lot of the people there have been fighting for their autonomy, for their independence, and the doctrine of uti Posideitis is the framework that was used for figuring out how these peoples would be administered, what states they would have once the European powers retreated. And of course, as I say in my notes here, uti Posideitis means you will have what you possess. That means that your independence is going to be based on the boundaries that the colonizers imposed on you in the first instance. So if you, say, were living in Rwanda, Rwanda is not a good example because that is actually a very old country, but say sub-Saharan Africa on the western side of Africa. The reality is that a lot of the states there were configured by the European powers in a manner that sort of gave each power a sort of a depth of reach into the continent, whereas the previously existing tribal peoples would have existed more in layers or waves parallel to the shoreline. So if you can imagine a series of ripples or waves as these sort of cultures or tribal cultures would have inhabited the land. There were upland and lowland peoples, etc., coastal peoples. All of those got sort of bisected by the European powers, and these peoples who didn't normally live together suddenly found themselves living together in these highly sort of artificial European states. But the doctrine of uti Posideitis meant that they all had to live together. And some people would say that this fact of having to live together today is sort of a key in terms of understanding where a lot of the ethnic conflict that we see in various parts of the world actually comes from. So there's pros and cons then to having the European model of nation states imposed on the world. There are many artificial states today. Czechoslovakia was an artificial state. Yugoslavia was an artificial state. Turkey today, artificial. Iraq certainly, and Israel certainly. Um, so where does where do these states stand? I mean, some of them have obviously been very successful. Others seem to have difficulty holding on to their legitimacy, and I think that's sort of par for the course. Now, I have a little note here about Kosovo independence in 2008, because that is an interesting example. Kosovo actually never really existed as an independent state, historically speaking, yet the Western powers granted it independence as its own nation state in 2008. And it's not clear what that actually means for us, because some nation states have, of course, histories of independence, like Croatia, and they were able to, in the Yugoslavian conflict, make a successful appeal for a restoration of their independence once Yugoslavia had fallen away. But Kosovo, of course, didn't. So the question would be maybe, like, is it a bad precedent to give a republic like that its own independence, or a country like that? Some people would say, why not? Everyone should have an independent republic, that's fine. And okay, if that's true, then you have to have your cake and you have to lie in your bed once you've made it. And the question would be, given a few years ago that there was trouble in Abkhazia, Georgia, where Russian minorities there wanted to declare their independence from Georgia, and Georgia was not happy about this at all. The Russian army mobilized. That situation is not yet resolved. But if Kosovo can have independence, why shouldn't these people of Abkhazia, Georgia, these Russians, have their own independent state as well? That's a very important question for us. So okay, let's call that the end of part one here, and we'll come back in just a little while.